first contact with Joshua Pope.
Hello, Earthlings. How you doing? Welcome back to First Contact Radio. I hope you had a really good weekend. So as we all know, this is the big 4th of July weekend, 4th of July week, and tomorrow is the celebration about our independence. But a lot of times in this day and age, we take for granted what that independence is, why we have it, what it's about, why we should be interested in keeping that independence. If we listen to the young kids in school these days, high school kids, college-age kids, they have a different way of seeing the world than those who are older than they do because of the way that they've been taught. Remember, for the last 30 years, 27 years, since 1990, the Muslim Brotherhood has been here in America with a plan to bring an ideology to American students, thereby change the discourse in America over the years. So we have these college students who are being taught things about our society from a different standpoint, different ideology. That's why we have this anti-American sentiment coming from so many young people that we're surprised that it comes from them. Because generally the college kids out there are raised in good families that have worked really hard to move forward, and then we see their kids going out there and getting some sort of indoctrination. There's always been issues with education and people trying to get in your head, but really these last 30 years has really been significant with what's moving forward. So I think it's really a good opportunity and chance for all of us to take a look at where we came from. How did we get here? What are we about? So I brought up a number of good sites. Let's delve into that for the course of this hour. Okay? So, the 4th of July, it is the time when we declared independence. Now, the actual date of July 2nd is the date when the Declaration was created. It wasn't signed until the 4th, so the day of the 4th is the reason we celebrate it, because we've actually formally signed it, and this was our declaration that we are declaring independence from England and from all of the tyranny that England represented. Tomorrow on the show, I'll be reading the Declaration. We'll get into all of that. But right now we have to look at how we got to the point where they felt the need to declare their independence from England, because that's a pretty big thing. You don't just take that lightly, as the document says. There was obviously strong reasons. In order to understand, we have to look back much further in history to the events leading up to that, because there was frictions going on in the United States, in the colonies that were here, but these frictions were happening in concurrence with what was happening in England. So let's take a trip back to history. And I found some really very good sites here, actually. I'm going to start with this one here. We're going to give ourselves a little bit of historical perspective. Okay, this one is called Usury Through History. The overall site is the Judeo-Masonic Conspiracy. Okay, you're not going to necessarily hear about this in your history books, which is why it's important to hear about it, because it's what took place. To understand the origins and the background to this conspiracy, it's important to have a basic understanding of the social and political problems that surrounded the most profitable and controversial type of business history has ever been seen: usury. One of the earliest examples in the written history of the problem with usury comes from the Holy Bible. In the times of Jesus Christ, Jewish people could only pay the temple taxes with a special coin called the half shekel, which was only a coin half an ounce of pure silver without the image of the pagan emperor, and for that matter was considered the only coin acceptable to God. However, half shekels were not plentiful, and the usurers, also known as money changers in those times, had a monopoly on their supply. This monopoly allowed them to raise its prices to whatever the market would bear, making huge profits, since all the Jews that went to Jerusalem had to exchange all of their coins for half shekels on their visit to the temple. The Jewish just totally violated the sanctity of God's house in an attempt to expel the usurers out of the temple. He charged against them and said, "It is written, my house shall be called the house of prayer, but you have made it a den of thieves." This was the only time Jesus was used force during his entire ministry. So the money changers back then, it gives us a different understanding when we understand how they were squeezing the people out of their money. Because people were turning in their money and only getting a coin that was worth half the value because that's what their church would accept it. Okay? So, but before, just 200 years before, Rome was also having problems with usurpers. This was the point when two emperors had to reform usury laws in an attempt to tackle the problem. Both emperors were assassinated. Julius Caesar also tried to put an end to the usurers' control over the money supply, but in 48 BC he took back the power to mint coins, money from the usurers, and he began to mint coins, making money plentiful and for the benefit of all. The Romans loved Julius Caesar for this decision, as he used the money for great public projects. But the usurers hated him for it, to the point that some historians believe this was an important factor in his assassination. After his death, there was a decrease in the money supply, and usury and debased coin became the rule, followed by an increase in taxes and corruption. The money supply in Rome was reduced by 90%. As a result, common people lost their lands and their homes, and the Roman Empire plunged into the Dark Ages. 1,000 years later, the Knights Templar invented an ingenious way to allow pilgrims to travel without cash and values in their way to Jerusalem, and therefore without the risk of being robbed during the journey. These travelers would leave their money and valuable items in the nearest Templar commandery. In exchange, they would receive a note and a cipher, or a code, which only the other Templars could interpret. Every time the traveler needed money along the way, he would simply go to the local Templar commandery and get some cash from his account, and the note then would be reciphered, and he would return home and would cash the rest of his money in his account in exchange for the note. But the most controversial service offered by the Templars was money lending, another of the many names for usury. With the money held in their deposit boxes from the pilgrims traveling to the Holy Land, they began to lend the emperors, priests, bishops, kings, and to whoever else needed a loan. Despite the strict laws against usury in those times, the church looked the other way. Furthermore, the church granted them a series of unprecedented concessions and privileges, which included freedom to cross borders, exception from taxes, being under no one's authority except the Pope himself, and so on. The most common explanation as to why the church allowed the Knights Templar to practice usury is believed to be in the gratitude for protecting pilgrims and defending the Catholic faith during their crusades. However, many believe it also has to do with the matters like their silence. The usurers, also known as the goldsmiths in medieval times, followed the system used by the Templars when the order was disbanded. The goldsmiths also realized that the depositors never came at the same time to withdraw all their savings or cash, and they thought that they could not only lend the money that really wasn't theirs, but to issue notes similar to the ones used by the Templars, promising a certain amount to the holder. This was the birth of paper money and the fractional reserve banking, which consists in lending more money than one held in deposit by printing promissory notes for the wealth that didn't exist. The services offered by the Knights Templar and later by the medieval goldsmiths became the model for the current economic and banking systems: money transfers, credit and checking, safety deposit boxes, pension plans, wills, and above all, money lending, promissory notes, paper money, and fractional banking reserve. Okay, so we haven't yet got to the Revolutionary War yet, but you could see the influence the banks are having. During the Middle Ages, there were not many ways for man to be wealthy without arousing suspicion, apart from feudal rent, which was the only accessible and privileged ones. An alternative way was the practice of usury, or lending money at interest. However, since usury was considered an increase in capital without any services provided, and an exchange in unequal quantities, it was forbidden by all Abrahamic religions. In other words, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, and those who practiced it were condemned and even prosecuted by the church and the state. Even though Judaism forbids usury, many Jews interpret the prohibition as a reference to Israelites lending to other Israelites. Therefore, they consider it ethical to lend money at a constant interest to Gentiles, which are non-Jews. For these reasons, usury was a common practice among European Jews, particularly also due to the local prejudices fueled by a wide range of accusations against the Jewish community, for example, kidnapping and sacrificing children. This prejudices prevented them from finding other occupations, though many of them managed to work as farmers, manual workers, and intellectuals. The profitability and the dangers of usury became evident in an example from 12th century Britain when King Henry II established that all Jewish properties in Britain amounted to 1/4 of the whole country. However, it is also worth noting that those properties were far equally shared amongst the Jewish community, and as we can see in the example of Aaron of Lincoln, a Jewish financier and well-known usurer whose debtors at his death owed him an amount equivalent to 1/16 of the total Jewish properties in Britain. During the Renaissance, usury was legalized, first in Britain, after King Henry VIII split from the Roman Catholic Church in 1545, through Rome, continued to condemn usury until the 19th century. During those times, in Italy, the word bank was first used since Roman times in reference to money lending. It derives from the Latin bancu, which translates us as desk or bench. The term was common between Florentine Jewish usurers who made their transactions above desks covered in green tablecloth. Now, an interesting matter related to this conspiracy theory is the finding out who were the European Jews and why did they settle through Europe, and most important, why did they excel in finances? To answer these questions, we need to go back to the times of the Roman Empire and follow the Jewish diasporas. After the first Jewish-Roman War in Judea, also known as the Great Revolt, the destruction of the Temple of Jerusalem in 70 CE, and the Bar Kokhba rebellion of 132 to 135 CE, the Romans no longer recognized the authority of any Jewish body, and the Jews were prohibited from living in Jerusalem. Furthermore, after Christianity became the official religion of Rome and Constantinople in 380, Jews were increasingly marginalized and brutally persecuted. The Jewish people spread throughout the Roman Empire into 3 groups and developed their own distinctive traditions. These 3 groups were the Mizrah Jews, the Sephardi Jews, and the Ashkenazi Jews. The main occupation of the Jews that remained in Palestine and Mesopotamia was still farming. However, the diaspora community's trade was more common. Talmudic learning began to emerge and assert its authority over the Jewish life through the diaspora, and the Rabbinic Judaism created a religious mandate for literacy, requiring all Jewish males to learn Hebrew and to read from the Torah. This emphasis on literacy and learning a second language would eventually be of great benefit to the Jews, allowing them to take on commercial and financial roles with the Gentile societies where literacy was often quite low and education reserved for the clergy and the nobility. The Mizrah Jews settled in the Middle East and North Africa after the Islamic conquest of the regions. Trade and commerce allowed them, as a highly literate people, to abandon farming and engage in occupations where they could better use their skills. In the Caliphate of Baghdad, the center of the Jewish world, the Jews took on many financial occupations. The Sephardi Jews settled in the Iberian Peninsula, today Spain and Portugal, during the Roman occupation. As citizens of the Roman Empire, the Jews of Hispaniola engaged in a variety of occupations, and until the adoption of Christianity, Jews had close relations with the non-Jewish populations and played an active role in the social and economic life. However, Christian authorities concerned with the Jewish presence began a series of prohibitions, like marriage of Christians with Jews, blessing Christian crops by Jews, and the sharing of meals by Christians and Jews. The situation completely changed after 387 AD with aggressive policies against them, which culminated in many orders of expulsion, forced conversion, isolation, enslavement, execution, and other punitive measures. The third group, and the one with which our conspiracy theory is most interested in, were the Ashkenazi Jews, which settled along northern and eastern Europe. At some point in the 8th or early 9th century, the Khazar royalty and nobility converted to Judaism, and part of the general population followed. The first Jewish Khazar king was Bulan, followed by King Abdullah, who strengthened Judaism, invited rabbis into the kingdom, and built synagogues. The descendants of the Jews moved to the Rhine in Germany from Alas in the south to the Rhineland in the north to the region of Ashkenaz, which the medieval Hebrew means Germany. There they also took many of the financial occupations, including money, lending, or usury. Now, some modern researchers doubt that these Ashkenazi Jews are from a Jewish origin at all and affirm that they are descendants of the Khazars that converted to Judaism during the 8th and 9th century. However, DNA studies carried out along the 1990s cleared up this issue and offered an explanation as to why many Ashkenazi Jews have European and not Middle Eastern features, for example, blonde hair, blue eyes. In regards to the Y chromosome passed on only by their father, a study published in 2000 showed that 12.5% of the total admixture of the Ashkenazi Jews contains mutations common among Middle Eastern peoples. And another study from 2005 based on Y chromosome polymorphic markers showed that Ashkenazi Jews are more closely related to other Jewish or Middle Eastern groups than to their host populations in Europe, though 11.5% of male Ashkenazi were found to belong to the RM17, the dominant Y chromosome haplogroup in Eastern Europeans. On the other hand, another study published in 2001 showed that 12.7% frequency of the EU19 chromosomes common in Eastern European peoples. In regards to the mitochondrial DNA passed on from the mother, a study in 2006 based on high-resolution analysis suggested that about 40% of the current Ashkenazi population is descended matrilineally from just 4 founder lineages. These are most likely from a Hebrew Levantine INT DNA pool originating in the Middle East in the 1st and 2nd century CE. In addition, the rest of the Ashkenazi mtDNA originates from around 150 lineages, most of those likely Middle Eastern origin. These studies clearly show that the Ashkenazi Jews are in fact a mixture between Middle Eastern and Eastern European races, and confirms the theory that proposes intermarriages between Jews from the Middle East and Khazars between the 2nd and 9th century CE. Okay. Now, the Rothschild family becomes introduced here. Many Jewish families followed the money lending or usury tradition through Europe, since the law in many countries didn't allow any Jew to own or make use of the land, and prejudices prevented them from finding other occupations. Commerce and banking, despised by the Catholic faith, were interpreted as ethical by some Jews. So they were activities that some Jewish families practiced in order to prosper. One of these families became notorious in the 18th century, Frankfurt am Germany, through a small coin shop and counting house owned by an usurer named Amschel Moses Bauer. The firstborn of 8 children was called Meyer Amschel Bauer, who was taught by his father all of the secrets of finances, money lending, and coin collection, for which he showed great aptitude. Meyer Amschel took over the family business in 1775 after his father's death, changing the family name to Rothschild, which corresponds to the shop's red sign, which in German is Rot, and the symbol on there, the shield, the red shield, or Rothschild. Now keep in mind, 1755. 1756, Meyer Amschel Rothschild starts working in a banking house in Hanover owned by another Jewish family, Oppenheimer, best known in modern times for one of its members, Robert, who's known in the world's Oppenheimer, the director of the Manhattan Project, which developed the first nuclear bomb during World War II. Through his work with the Oppenheimer family, Meyer came in contact with General von Estor. Von Estor introduces Meyer to the court of Prince William I of Hesse-Hanau, one of the richest royal houses in Europe. Meyer incrementally considered his family's fortune by working as a financier for Prince William I, where he discovered that lending to governments is far more profitable and secure than lending to ordinary people. His duty also included hiring the Hesse soldiers to foreign nations on behalf of William I, and also realized how profitable wars are by witnessing how the Hesse fortune grew above that of other royal houses in Europe. However, back in those days, wealth did not give a man rights or social status. We saw already that Jews were not allowed to own or to make use of lands, and we also saw that the church despised and condemned usury. It was during these times when a movement among Jewish intellectuals emerged in Germany. This movement pursued the eradication of the monarchy and the church, both also in the way of the Rothschild interest, and infiltrated or created secret societies to achieve those goals by any means. Okay, so now we're starting to get closer to America's involvement. The next chapter here is American Revolution. Meanwhile, on the other side of the pond, a revolution was about to start against George III, King of Great Britain. It's obvious that the American colonies had legitimate reasons to demand independence, but what's odd about the uprising is the fact that a large number of those promoting the revolt were actually members of secret societies, mainly Freemasonry. For example, from the 56 signers of the Declaration of Independence, at least 16% were Freemasons. From the 39 signers of the U.S. Constitution, at least 33% were Freemasons. And from the 74 generals in the Continental Army, at least 34 or 46% of them were Freemasons. It was also odd that every major building in Washington, D.C. had a cornerstone laid down under Masonic ritual. For example, the Capitol building laid by George Washington, the Washington Monument, the Smithsonian, the White House, the Independence Hall in Philadelphia, laid by Benjamin Franklin and many others. And it's even odder that a Christian nation like the U.S. was packed with a multitude of Masonic, occult, and pagan symbolism. I personally have no doubt that the American Revolution was mainly a Masonic uprising, since the most common Americans didn't even take part in it, and I have no reason to doubt that most of them might have noble intentions, though it is not the object of this essay to judge Freemasonry. But you must be asking by now, where's the relation between the American Freemason usury and the Rothschild family, apart from the fact that the Scottish Rite of Freemasonry and the Rothschild family shared the same emblem and both had the monarchy in their way. A highly probable connection is the Jewish immigrant named Hyman Solomon. He journeyed around Europe during the 1760s and acquired knowledge of finances and language. In 1775, he arrived in New York, where he established himself as a broker dealing with overseas trade between Europe and the colonies. He joined the Sons of Liberty and was captured by the British twice, who wanted to use him as a translator within the Hessian mercenaries. Yes, the same ones that the Rothschilds hired on behalf of William I to other nations, and which were casually employed by the British at the time. In fact, the Solomon that spoke the same language as the Hessian mercenaries proves nonetheless that he was for a few years in the same country as Mayer Rothschild. But that still doesn't prove any connection. However, the odd part about Solomon's story is not his involvement in the revolution that had absolutely nothing to do with him, or that he was able to establish himself as a financier on arrival to New York, or that he had frequent contacts with Europe through his business, or that he was captured twice by the British and both times managed to escape, even the last time when he was due for execution. The odd part of the story is that he ended selling bills of exchange to American merchants, supporting various members of the Constitutional Congress in negotiating the sale of the majority of the war aid from France and Holland. And he achieved all this before the war ended. I personally find it difficult to believe that he could have achieved all this on his own without being well connected both in New York and overseas, but that's just my opinion. Besides, that's not the end of the story. Some researchers believe that while he was seeking funding for the war in Europe, Holland and France, he met with the Rothschilds, who allegedly gave him, along with the Sassoon family, £3.5 million. However, the other researchers say it's not possible that Solomon ever met a Rothschild, since the Rothschilds didn't establish themselves in France until a few years later. But this argument doesn't really prove that Solomon did not visit Germany again to see the Rothschilds. After all, Germany is a neighboring country to both France and Holland. Other researchers say it doesn't make sense because Mayer Rothschild had just hired the Hessian army to the British, but it also doesn't prove anything, as the Rothschilds could have hired the army on behalf of William I to the British and at the same time found the revolution with their own money, or even convinced William I to play both sides. On the other hand, we have Alexander Hamilton, who some believe was a Rothschild agent. Hamilton's mother was first married to Johann Michael Lavian, a Jewish German merchant from whom she separated in 1950, 5 years before Hamilton's birth. Because of this separation, she could not legally marry again with Hamilton's father, James A. Therefore, Hamilton was not allowed in the local Christian school. Instead, he had individual tutoring classes in a private Jewish school. He became the first U.S. Secretary of the Treasury, founding father, economist, political philosopher, and chief of staff for George Washington. He was also one of the most influential members of the Washington cabinet and his financial expert. Hamilton was advocated for the establishment of a federal bank to be owned by private interests and for the creation of debt money, for which he used false arguments to convince Washington. Eventually, he convinced the president despite the opposition of Thomas Jefferson, and a federal bank was created in 1791 with 20-year charter. Although this was termed the Bank of the United States, it was not owned by the nation. The name was purposely chosen to deceive the American population and make them believe that they were owners of the bank. The charter for the bank ran out in 1811, and Congress voted against its renewal, thanks to influence of Thomas Jefferson and Andrew Jackson. To be completely fair, at this point we should ask ourselves a simple question: if both Jefferson and Washington were Freemasons, supposedly connected through Freemasonry with the international bankers, and shared the same goal and agenda, why did they disagree on such important issues as the federal bank? To complicate matters even further, it is a well-known fact that Jefferson spoke in admiration of Adam Weishaupt, a founder of the Illuminati order and the Rothschild agent, as I will expose in the next chapter. In various occasions, even though he was the one against the federal bank, Jefferson said if Weishaupt had written here, where no secrecy is necessary in our endeavors to render men wise and virtuous, he would not have thought of any secret machinery for that purpose. He also tagged Weishaupt as an enthusiastic philanthropist. Washington also wrote in a letter from 1798 about Weishaupt's Illuminati, "It was not my intention to doubt that the doctrines for the Illuminati and the principles of Jehovianism had not spread for the United States. On the contrary, no one is more truly satisfied with this fact than I." Therefore, there is no doubt that both Jefferson and Washington agreed with Weishaupt's philosophy, as most Freemasons probably do in those times. But this does not prove that American Freemasons were directly and knowledgeably involved in the bankers' plot, nor directly connected to Weishaupt's Illuminati, which was created 1 year after the American Revolution began. What is true is the American Freemasons, through their revolutions, facilitated Mayor Rothschild's first attempt to expand his banking business overseas, which nearly succeeded, and that is definitely a good reason to fund and promote a revolution, as we'll clearly see during the chapters of the French Revolution. So, what this brings us is a little summary. It's all about the bankers, right? In this day and age, we're dealing with the international bankers. So here we had America, which freed itself from England. We're here in America standing on our own. All the while, in Britain, they're continuing to impose more and more regulations, more taxes upon the American people. The American people had enough. The people in Europe, they could see that this was taking place, so they wanted to get more control. The bankers were the ones who were already funding America, but the money was coming from overseas. So now the whole concept was to get a bank here on American soil, run by the same bankers, the Rothschilds. These Ashkenazi Jews were going to run the banks here in America, and that's how they would get their stronghold here. And it was during the time of George Washington when the first bank came in. But eventually that bank was stopped. And then they tried again years later in the 1800s with a second bank. That bank succeeded for several years, but then Andrew Jackson stopped that bank. And so then they tried again. This time was the final time that they succeeded, and that was in 1913 with the Federal Reserve Act. And from that point in time, we have had the bankers in control of America. Because the United States of America is a corporation, we go back to 1871, this was the year that the United States of America became a corporation. So there's been this slow creep from the bankers expanding over time. And now the Revolutionary War was a war that involved these bankers trying to expand here into America to get a stronghold. Eventually, as we can see, they did win because they did get a stronghold here for a short period. It got stopped, and then it came back again, and then it got stopped, and it came back again, and it's still here. Let me read a few other pieces because this isn't the only piece on the subject here. And you can see as you go through here, there's a lot more you can read about here. Benjamin Franklin and his connection, because Franklin was connected in with secret societies overseas. He was connected in with the funders that were providing the money, and so he is thought of as somehow connected in, though says the conclusion on the connection between the Rothschilds and the American Revolution, it did exist through Alexander Hamilton, who could only push the agenda for the first 20 years of independence. That's the bank. And he also could possibly through Solomon and Franklin, though it made no difference at the end. It is true that the American Freemasons shared the same ideology that emerged from Jewish intellectuals in Germany and spread throughout secret societies, but I'm having a hard time relating the founding fathers directly to the Rothschilds, with the exception of Franklin. Obviously, he had his hands in too far many pies as to count as confirmed agent for any side. Okay, so let me jump away from this one here to, there's another good piece here. It's called The American Revolution. The links will be available, firstcontactradio.com, or under the video here at YouTube. It says, in order to understand how men who obtained control of the Bank of England and the British National Den also attained control of the trade and commerce and the monetary system of Britain's America colonies, it will be sufficient if we pick up the threads of the story at the time of Benjamin Franklin. This was 1706 to 1790. He went over to England to represent the interests of the men who had been associated with him in building up the prosperity of the American colonies. Robert L. Owen, former chairman, Committee of Banking and Currency, United States Senate, explains the matter on page 98 of the Senate document number 23. He states that when associates of the Rothschilds asked Franklin how he accounted for the prosperous conditions prevailing in the colonies, he replied, "That is simple. In the colonies, we issue our own money. It's called colonial script. We issue it in proper proportion to the demands of trade and industry." L. Robert Owens remarked that not very long after the Rothschilds heard of this, they realized the opportunity to exploit the situation with considerable profit to themselves. The obvious thing to do was to have a law passed prohibiting the colonial officials from issuing their own money and make it compulsory for them to obtain money they required through the medium of the banks. Amtchild Mayor Rothschild was still in Germany, but he was supplying the British government with mercenary troops at £8 per man. Such was his influence that in 1764 he succeeded through the directors of the Bank of England in having laws passed in accordance with his dictates. The authorities in the colonies had to discard their scrip money. They had to mortgage the colonial assets and securities to the Bank of England in order to borrow money they needed to carry on business. Referring to those facts, Benjamin Franklin stated that in 1 year the conditions were so reversed that the era of prosperity ended and the depression set in, to such the extent that the streets and the colonies were filled with unemployed. Franklin stated, the Bank of England refused to give more than 50 cents of the face value of the scrip when turned over as required by law. The circulating medium of exchange was thus reduced by half. Mr. Franklin disclosed the primary cause of the revolution when he said the colonies would rather have to borne the little tax on tea and other matters than had it not been that England took away from the colonies their money, which created unemployment and dissatisfaction. Dissatisfaction became general, but very, very few colonials realized that the taxation and the other economic sanctions being imposed on them were the results of the activities of a small group of international gangsters who had succeeded in obtaining control of the British Treasury. after they had obtained control of the Bank of England. It had already been shown how they jumped Britain's national debt from £1,250,000 in 1694 to £16 million in 1668, and increased it progressively to $885 million in 1815 to $22,503,532,372 by 1945. On April 19, 1775, the first armed clashes between the British and colonials took place at Lexington and Concord. On May 10th, the Second Continental Congress met at Philadelphia, and George Washington was placed at the head of the naval and military force. He took command at Cambridge on July 4th, 1776. Congress adopted the Declaration of Independence. On October 19th, 1781, the British commander, General Cornwallis, surrendered his whole army, including what was left of the Hessians. On September 3rd, 1783, the independence of the United States was recognized by Peace Treaty of Paris. The only real looters were the British people. Their national debt had increased tremendously, and the international moneylenders, who were in reality the secret power behind the world revolutionary movement, had succeeded in the first stage of a long-range plans toward the dissolution of the British Empire. The agents of the international bankers worked industriously to prevent unity by keeping the various states in America separated. It was much easier to exploit them. To prove the continuity of the foreign moneylenders meddling to the affairs of every nation, it is sufficient to record that the founding fathers of the United States, meeting at Philadelphia in 1787, talked over the importance of bringing in some form of legislation which would protect them against the exploitation of the international bankers. Okay, so again, we're talking about a situation with international bankers. These international bankers are connected into the Illuminati formed by Adam Weishaupt. As you could see through these connections, the Illuminati were able to infiltrate into the groups and the mindset that was going on. Here we have a letter from our nation's first president and commander-in-general of the American Revolutionary War, written in 1798, which affirms that he knew that the Illuminati, based in Europe, had arrived on American shores. The revolution, which began with an uproar over the Stamp Act in 1765, led to the Boston Tea Party in 1773, solidified the first battle at Lexington and Concord in 1775, then took shape via a bold Declaration of Independence in 1776, which continued through a long, exhausting campaign of endurance against the history's most powerful empire, did not end with decisive victory at Yorktown in 1781. Nor did it end with the compilation of the Constitution after the extensive deliberations at the conventions at the battle for the Bill of Rights, and ratifications not only that continued the debate but complicated it with important questions about the nature of government and the limitations that should be put upon it. Rather than concluding with the ratification of the Constitution with the added demanded Bill of Rights in 1791 by the several states, this struggle continued through the fraction rights of the Federalists, the Anti-Federalists, and the Democrat Republicans. Who was the American Revolution really for? Who really won that revolution, and who does it serve now? What is the proper role of government in our lives, and what has it transformed in today? As president, Washington tried to remain neutral to these disputes in his official capacity and public persona, though in reality he was more closely aligned with the Federalists, who stacked figures like Alexander Hamilton in his cabinet. Thomas Jefferson, who led the Democratic-Republican Party, backed in turn by the Democratic Societies, was scrutinized by many in the founding era for his personal beliefs and relationships with the conspiratorial European elements. Washington's response about the Illuminati's influence in America followed the significant uproar caused by the printing and circulation of John Robinson's Proofs of a Conspiracy. This work was propagated in particular by geographer and pastor Jedediah Morse, especially in Massachusetts and other northern states, where it gripped the Protestant Federalist circles there, who had grown to view Jefferson and his ilk as nefarious characters working against the Americans they had fought to create. and who had believed to be involved with the odious tenets of the French Revolution and the Illuminati organizations who had perpetuated it. It is important context that George Washington wrote this letter below approximately a year and a half before his death in 1799, not to dispel the rumors of the Illuminati and its presence in America. Instead, Washington meant to clarify that the Illuminati was not carried in the halls of Masonry at large, but in the circles of the Jeffersonian Democratic Republic secret societies who strongly opposed the Federalists in control of the government. It's a letter from George Washington to Reverend G.W. Snyder, dated October 24th, 1798. Reverend Sir, I have your favor of the 17th instant before me, and my only motive to trouble you with the receipt of this letter is to explain and correct the mistake which I perceive the hurry in which I am obliged often to write letters have led into you. It was not my intention to doubt the doctrines of the Illuminati, and the principles of Jacobinism had not spread in the United States. On the contrary, no one is more truly satisfied of this fact than I am. The idea I meant to convey was that I did not believe that the lodges of Freemasons in this country had, as societies, endeavored to propagate the diabolical tenets of the first or the pernicious principles of the latter, if they are susceptible of separation, that individuals of them may have done it, or that the founder or the instrument employed be found. The democratic societies of the United States may have had these objects and actually had a separation from the people from their government in view is too evident to be questioned. My occupations are such that but little leisure is allowed me to read newspapers or books of any kind. The reading of letters and preparing answers absorb much of my time, with respect, etc. But a year and a half before his death, George Washington issued a letter confirming the doctrines of the Illuminati and principles of Jacobinism had indeed spread not only through Masonry, but as some believed, throughout the Jefferson-linked Democratic Republican societies. This revolution was different and set apart a minimum from other revolutions that inevitably soured with the usurpation of power by dictators who either helped lead the revolution or came to power on its heels by facts that it resisted the forces that would establish a dictator, king, or other form of autocratic rule. And absolute power corrupts absolutely, said Lord Acton. The American Revolution fortunately did not become a historical case of absolute tyranny, yet there were many important struggles for power among many factors and key leaders of early America. Indeed, it was rife with conspiracy, subterfuge, and plain old corruption. Illuminati Manifesto of World Revolution by Marco de Luchetti, technically a forward to conspirator of the French Revolution, Nicolas Bonneville's 1972 book L'Esprit des Religions, explains how the French secret society published Les Cercles Sociaux, housed of the French members of the Bavarian Illuminati who carried out a definite conspiracy via the French Revolution. Included in the key backers of this Illuminati conspiracy are the Rothschild family, who bankrolled founder Adam Weishaupt, the Sachs-Gotha family, who protected Weishaupt, who after the secret group was exposed, as well as the Marseille de la Fête, who served as a general in the American Revolution and as a leader of the Garde Nationale in the French Revolution. The French branch of the Illuminati comprised a distinct fraction inside of this Jacobins via a political cadre generally referred to as the Godons. This group was later overpowered by the Montagnards, also the Jacobins, as detailed at length by the Luchetti. He argues that under the leadership of Robespierre, they took over the revolution already underway, carrying out not only the executions of thousands of aristocrats and clergy members, but exacting also a larger depopulation effort, particularly among the plebiscites. Okay, so there's a lot more to this article. I'm going to leave this here. I want to look at some of these timelines here. Here's the American Revolution over at Wikipedia. American Revolution was a colonial revolt that took place between 1765 and 1783. The American patriots in the 13 colonies won the independence from Great Britain, becoming the United States of America. In alliance with France and others, it defeated the British in the American Revolutionary War. Starting in 1765, members of the American Colonial Society, arguing the position, no taxation without representation, rejected the authority of the British Parliament to tax them because they lacked representation in Parliament. Protest steadily escalated to the Boston Tea Party in 1773, during which patriots destroyed a consignment of tax tea. The British responded by closing Boston Harbor, then followed with a series of legislative acts which effectively rescinded Massachusetts Bay Colony's right of self-governance and caused the other colonies to rally behind Massachusetts. In late 1774, the Patriots set up their own alternative government to better coordinate their resistance efforts against Great Britain, while other colonists preferred to remain aligned with the British Crown and were known as Loyalists or Tories. Tensions erupted into the battle between Patriot militia and British regulators when the British attempted to capture and destroy colonial military supplies at Lexington and Concord in April 1775. The conflict then developed into a global war during which the Patriots and later their French, Spanish, and Dutch allies fought the British and the Loyalists in what became known as the American Revolutionary War, 1775 to 1783. Each of the 13 colonies formed a provincial congress that assumed power from the old colonial governments and suppressed loyalism. From there, they built a Continental Army under the leadership of General George Washington. The Continental Congress determined King George's rule to be tyrannical and infringing the colonists' right as Englishmen, and they declared the colonies free and independent states on July 2nd, 1776. The Patriot leadership professed the political philosophies of liberalism and republicanism to reject monarchy and aristocracy. And then they proclaimed that all men are created equal. The Continental Army forced Britain out of Boston in 1776, but the British captured and held New York City for the duration of the war. They blockaded ports and captured other cities for brief periods, but they failed to defeat Washington's forces. The Patriots unsuccessfully attempted to invade Canada during the winter of 1775 and 76, but they captured a British army at the Battle of Saratoga in late 1777, and the French entered the war as allies of the United States as a result. The war later turned to the American South, where the British, under the leadership of Charles Cornwallis, captured an army at South Carolina but failed to enlist enough volunteers from loyal civilians to take effective control of the territory. A combined American-French force captured a second British army at Yorktown in 1781, effectively ending the war in the United States. The Treaty of Paris in 1783 formally ended the conflict, confirming the new nation's complete separation from British Empire. The United States took possession of nearly all the territory east of the Mississippi River and south of the Great Lakes, with the British retaining control of Canada and Spain taking Florida. Among the significant results of the revolution was the creation of the new Constitution of the United States. The Constitution established a relatively strong federal national government that included an executive, a national judiciary, and a bicameral Congress that represented states in the Senate and population in the House of Representatives. The revolution also resulted in the immigration of around 60,000 loyalists to other British territories. Okay, so I want you to remember here, this is very important, the Constitution of the United States, okay? Constitution of the United States. Now let's take a quick look here at some timelines of the Revolutionary War. You can go through and read through all of these, the things that we just discussed. But there's something very important that needs to be known, and this happened during 1871. Let's see if it's down here on this timeline. Nope. Okay, these are all around the Revolutionary War. What happened was in 1871, what was called the Act of 1871, or the Act to provide a government for the District of Columbia, was formed. And during this time, essentially, the United States became a corporation. So instead of being the United States Corporation of the United States, or the United States Constitution of the United States, which was for the people, it now became the Constitution, all capital letters, Constitution for the United States of America, because now the United States is a corporate entity. And that's where we are these days. As we move throughout time, as I said, in 1913, the Federal Reserve Act came into place. The IRS came around that same time. The Social Security Act came into place. There was a stock market crash designed by the bankers once they got in power to get now everybody under their control. Once they crashed everything, the Social Security Act was put in place, and now everybody had to have a Social Security number. You now were taken off of the sovereign system of being a sovereign to the United States, and you are now put within the federal territory of the United States. That Social Security number became like a slave number to everyone. Now you get them when you're born, and these numbers, believe it or not, I can do a whole nother bit on this. These numbers are put on the stock market from the time we're born. So we are actually bought and sold from the time we're born, traded on the stock market. You can look that up if you don't believe me. In 1921, the Council on Foreign Relations came around. Remember I told you about that the other day? So we've got all this control coming in place. Once they locked in their control, the banker control, next thing they came in, controlled the media. So now what's going to go out and be told to the people is only going to be what those in power want it to be. 1945, you've got Project Paperclips. You got all the Nazi scientists coming in from where? Germany, the same place where all of these Eastern European Ashkenazi Jews, these bankers, the Rothschilds. So now they're coming in from the same place. We have the nuclear testing going on about that time, the nuclear explosions. 1947, Roswell. We're remembering that this weekend. CIA comes along the same time. 1948, a year later, Project Mockingbird. The CIA, which has now been formed a year earlier, is now infiltrating the media. And that brings us, 60 years, 70 years from where we are now. So 70 years from where we are now, this was the level of control that was locked in. So imagine where we've gone over all these years. When 9/11 came along, that really locked us into a whole nother system of control. One of the things that occurred that was very significant in the timeline, let me back up, in 1784, a messenger that was connected with Adam Weishaupt and the Illuminati was carrying a message, and he was struck by lightning. His message was connected, and his message basically was talking about the future goals of the New World Order through revolution. So this was captured back then. So as far back as the founding of the United States of America, there has been groups that have out there talking about a new world order with plans. So you know that there's been those that have been part of these secretive organizations since that time to take down our country. Okay? And we've heard a lot more about them because we have the technology as time goes by that we can share this information and learn about more. But that's what's going on. We've been fighting the bankers for such a long period of time. Now, if the young people, if people learning really understood this, you would understand where Hillary would have taken us versus where Donald Trump is. Okay? Donald Trump isn't connected in with all of those bankers. He was someone who is not part of their club. He's not part of that inner group, but he has an understanding of how they work. And anybody who has spent any time studying or looking at the New World Order agenda should be cheering right now that we have someone in place that is not taking us to the completion of the New World Order agenda. Because Hillary would have brought that full circle. George H.W. Bush talked about it. Remember, he was also there supporting Hillary. She would have brought it full circle. 2020 would have been the end of her first term. Coincidentally, that would have also been the same time that the 30-year plan, the Muslim Brotherhood plan to take over, came to a conclusion. So 2020 would have been a big year for America, going really down the drain. We would have been in a bad, bad way, because everything that Hillary represents in connection with those bankers, the same thing Obama's connected to, is what we would have gone into. All of that nonsense, that garbage we've been pulling away from. So I wanted to go over this really thoroughly. Took the whole hour to do so. because there's so much here. The links are available, firstcontactradio.com. The links are available because we need to understand our true history. We need to share this. I know that people don't want to hear about where America came from at times. They get bored with it because they've been conditioned not to think about it, but we've been fighting the same battle for a long time. Donald Trump is fighting the same battle as we the people. Those who are in power that are trying to take over America are the ones fighting against President Trump and all of those trying to remain free. So we need to get on board with this, my friends. We need to share the message and understand where we are and where we could be had we not averted this problem. We're still battling. The swamp still needs to be drained, but we are making America great again each and every day. Okay? So keep the faith, my friends. Tomorrow is our 4th of July, our first one with this new awesome president, Donald Trump. Celebrate it. Have a great day. Tomorrow I'm going to be going over the Declaration of Independence. We're going to talk about in depth what that means, but now you have an understanding of how we got there. That's it. I'll be back. Have yourselves an awesome day. Peace. I'm out of here. Out of here.
10 seconds.